Have you ever stopped to think about how a figure who lived more than 2,000 years ago continues to influence billions of people around the world? From crosses in churches to references in movies and books, Jesus Christ is a constant presence in our lives. But what do we know about the man behind the faith? Is there historical evidence to prove his existence? In today's video, we'll dive into ancient documents, explore archaeological discoveries, and analyze what history tells us about Jesus. Get ready for a revealing journey into one of the most influential figures of all time. Chapter 1. The Global Impact of Christianity. From the beginning of the 1st century, Christianity spread like an unstoppable phenomenon, influencing not just the West, but also civilizations around the world. What began with a small group of Jesus followers in ancient Palestine quickly became the dominant faith of the Roman Empire, laying the foundations for European culture and expanding to the Americas, Africa. Today, more than 2 billion people identify as Christians, showing that Christ's message transcended geographical and temporal barriers in a unique way in history. Despite this global influence, the historical figure of Jesus is often obscured by his religious representation. We ask ourselves, who was this man who caused such a profound transformation in humanity? From powerful political figures to artists, many were impacted by his teachings. Even those who do not profess the Christian faith recognize Jesus' importance as one of the most remarkable figures in history. The fact that he was not just a religious figure, but also a historical one, raises a fundamental question. How can we confirm his existence outside the biblical accounts? While we have an abundance of evidence of Christianity over the centuries, finding direct proof of Jesus' existence is more challenging. This leads us to a fascinating analysis of historical documents and archaeological sources which, though indirect, point to his existence. When we examine this evidence, we realize that there's more than just myths or beliefs. And this raises the question, if Jesus was indeed a historical figure, why haven't we found direct material evidence like his tomb or personal artifacts? To understand this, we must first remember that Jesus wasn't a political leader or a military commander. He was a man who lived as a carpenter in a peripheral province of the Roman Empire. His lack of high social status may explain the absence of monuments or direct records of him, something common for non-elite figures of that time. Additionally, archaeological records from ancient Palestine are notoriously scarce, especially for figures like Jesus, who held no official positions. Despite this absence of direct material evidence, the figure of Jesus survived in textual records and oral traditions. Ancient texts are a valuable testimony to the impact of his life and his followers, as well as offering clues to his historical existence. These texts include both Christian and Roman and Jewish sources, which leads us to a deeper analysis of documents that, surprisingly, mention or refer to Jesus. Chapter 2. Archaeological Evidence. When we think of uncovering the past, archaeology usually comes to mind as the primary tool. We expect artifacts, tombs, and structures that reveal the secrets of the ancient world. However, when it comes to Jesus, the archaeological reality is more complex. There are no physical records directly linked to him, no personal object, identified ossuary, or tomb that we can associate with the man who changed the course of history. This might seem surprising, but when we look at the context of the time, it makes complete sense. Jesus wasn't a ruler, a Roman official, or someone with high social status, as we mentioned earlier. He lived as a common man in a small peripheral region of the empire. Thus, the absence of archaeological findings related to him is understandable. Most archaeological records we have from the period refer to Roman elites or powerful figures who left a tangible legacy, like Pontius Pilate. Interestingly, it was the discovery of a stone with Pilate's name inscribed on it in Caesarea Maritima that gave us one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence related to the events mentioned in the Gospels. But while there is no material evidence of Jesus himself, we find fascinating clues about his contemporaries. One example is the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest who, according to the New Testament, was involved in Jesus' trial. Caiaphas's ossuary was discovered in Jerusalem in 1990, and inscribed on it are the words Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Finds like this remind us that the figures surrounding Jesus were historical, reinforcing the narrative of his existence. Another intriguing point is the number of ossuaries found containing common names like Jesus, James, and Joseph, showing how common these names were in the Jewish context of the 1st century. This, on one hand, complicates the precise identification of artifacts directly linked to biblical figures, but on the other hand, situates Jesus in a very concrete historical and cultural setting. He wasn't an isolated figure, but part of a society whose burial practices, rituals, and lifestyles have been unearthed over the centuries. Additionally, the ruins of cities and villages mentioned in the New Testament, like Capernaum, also corroborate the existence of a vibrant region where Jesus preached. Excavations in Capernaum have revealed synagogues and simple houses dating to Jesus' time, allowing us to visualize what the setting might have been like where he taught and healed, even if we cannot directly link these places to him. What these indirect archaeological findings show us is that, while we don't have personal objects or direct evidence of Jesus, we have a rich vision of the context and the figures around him. This doesn't diminish his historical relevance, but rather challenges us to understand his life within the broader context of ancient Palestine, which is, in itself, a fascinating journey. Chapter 3. Textual Evidence. While direct archaeological evidence of Jesus is rare, what truly strengthens the argument for his existence is the ancient texts. Unlike other historical figures whose legacies rely on a single source, we have a variety of authors mentioning Jesus in different contexts, and these writings come from both Christian sources and Roman and Jewish historians, providing a rich and multifaceted view of Jesus' life and his impact. Among Roman historians, Tacitus is one of the most cited. In the early 2nd century, he wrote in his Annals about the persecution of Christians by Nero after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Tacitus explicitly mentions that the Christians followed Christ, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. This reference is crucial because Tacitus, being a renowned Roman historian, had no interest in promoting Christianity, which makes his account an impartial source about the existence of Jesus and his followers. Another important Roman author is Pliny the Younger, who, in his letters to Emperor Trajan, described the Christians as followers of Christ, highlighting that they worshipped Jesus as a god. Though he doesn't go into detail about Jesus' life, his descriptions reveal the rapid growth of Christianity and the significance of Jesus, even to those who were not his followers. It's fascinating to think that the cult of Christ was already strong enough to attract the attention of Roman authorities just a few decades after his death. Among Jewish authors, the work of Flavius Josephus stands out. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written at the end of the 1st century, Josephus makes 2 references to Jesus. The most famous of these, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man and mentions his crucifixion under Pilate. Though this passage has been the subject of debate due to possible Christian interpolations, most scholars agree that at least part of it is authentic and represents a valuable external reference to Jesus. Additionally, Josephus mentions James, the brother of Jesus who is called Christ, further linking the texts to the historicity of Jesus. These sources, though brief, are extremely significant. They show that Jesus was known by various cultures, and that his life and death were real events recorded by authors who had no connection to the nascent Christian movement. And this diversity of mentions is what strengthens the historical argument. After all, for a figure who held no political, military, or economic power, it's remarkable that his existence was documented by authors from different parts of the Roman Empire. By examining these texts, we can see that Jesus' presence in history goes beyond faith. He is mentioned alongside kings and governors, social movements, and historical events, not as a mythical figure, but as a man who, during his lifetime, made such a profound impact that it echoed for centuries. Chapter 4. Flavius Josephus and other Jewish historians. Among Jewish historians, Flavius Josephus stands out when we talk about the historical evidence of Jesus. Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, was an important Jewish historian and military leader, known for his works documenting the history of the Jews and the turbulent relationship between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. In his work, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus makes 2 references to Jesus, and these passages have become central pieces in the study of Jesus' historicity. The first mention, called the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, and a teacher, referring to his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate and the resurrection proclaimed by his followers. However, this passage has generated much debate among scholars, mainly due to possible interpolations made by Christian scribes over the centuries. Many believe that some parts of the original text may have been altered to emphasize Jesus' divinity, something a Jew like Josephus would hardly have affirmed so clearly. Nevertheless, it is widely accepted that a more neutral version of this testimony probably existed and that Josephus did, in fact, mention Jesus in his writings. Later in Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions another key figure, James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. This passage is less contested and provides strong evidence that Jesus was a recognized historical figure, not just a religious leader, but someone with a family and a network of followers who continued his work after his death. The reference to James is important because it connects Jesus to a real person known in the Jewish community, not just to a distant or mythical character. In addition to Josephus, other Jewish historians from the period and later discuss the environment in which Jesus lived and how his message impacted Jewish society at the time. Although there are no mentions as direct as those of Josephus, these texts help to build a historical setting that explains how a movement like Christianity could arise and spread amid the political and social tensions of first-century Palestine. The Jews were under Roman occupation, and there was a strong expectation of a Messiah who would liberate the people. Jesus, with his messages of hope and salvation, inserted himself into this context and attracted crowds, which naturally caught the attention of both Jewish and Roman historians. It's worth noting that these texts, when studied together, form a solid foundation for the argument that Jesus was a real figure who lived and impacted his community in a way that reverberated for generations. His mention in historical works that do not have a religious agenda shows that his existence was, in fact, relevant beyond the scope of Christian faith. The acceptance of Jesus by Jewish historians also puts into perspective the lasting impact he had not only on his followers but also on his society. Thus, the works of Flavius Josephus and other Jewish historians offer us a detailed look at the Jewish context in which Jesus lived and the people who surrounded him. These sources, being non-Christian, are invaluable to scholars because they provide an impartial view and help us understand the historical weight of Jesus as a figure. Chapter 5. The New Testament as a historical source. Although the New Testament is primarily considered a religious text, it also contains valuable information about the historical context of the first century and about the life of Jesus. Much more than just a spiritual account, the Gospels and Apostolic letters are sources that offer a detailed view of society, political and religious tensions, and the characters who shaped that time. Unlike other ancient scriptures, these texts were written relatively shortly after the events they describe, which gives them particular historical relevance. The letters of St. Paul, for example, are some of the oldest texts in the New Testament and date back to just 2 or 3 decades after J. In them, Paul speaks of Christ as someone who lived recently, who was crucified and resurrected. He mentions contemporary events and people, like Peter and James, reinforcing the idea that Jesus was a real historical figure, not a myth that developed over centuries. It's important to note that Paul, in his letters, wasn't writing a biography of Jesus, but his references to him in an everyday and practical context are crucial to the historicity of Christ. The Gospels, which began to be written about 30 to 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, provide a more detailed account of his life, teachings, and miracles. Although scholars consider the Gospels to have been written with a theological purpose, it's impossible to ignore the fact that they contain historically verifiable information about first-century Palestine. The names of places, cultural practices, and even figures like Pontius Pilate are confirmed by external sources, which lends credibility. Furthermore, the consistency among the 4 canonical Gospels, despite their stylistic and emphasis variations, suggests that they are based on a common tradition of oral and written accounts circulating among early Christians. Another interesting aspect is that the Gospels were written at a time when there were still eyewitnesses to the events described. This means that the authors were writing for an audience that could confirm or question the accuracy of the accounts. If Jesus hadn't been a real figure, it would have been very difficult for such a detailed and precise story to survive and spread so quickly among communities living close to the event's locations. Finally, the New Testament writings document the growth of Christianity in a hostile society. If Jesus were a myth, it would be unlikely that his followers would be willing to face such brutal persecutions for something they knew to be fabricated. The steadfastness of the early Christians, many of whom chose martyrdom over denying Jesus, is further evidence of the real and tangible impact he had on their lives. The New Testament, therefore, goes beyond being just a collection of religious texts. It is a historical source that, when read critically, provides a clear panorama of first-century Palestine, the customs and authority figures of the time, and Jesus himself. This makes it a crucial piece in the puzzle of Christ's historicity, complementing non-Christian sources with the perspective of those who lived close to the events. Throughout this video, we explored the various historical evidence that points to the existence of Jesus, from the writings of Roman historians like Tacitus and Pliny, to the valuable mentions by Flavius Josephus and the richness of the New Testament itself. It's clear that Jesus wasn't just a mythological or symbolic figure, but someone who truly lived and deeply impacted first-century society. Though direct material evidence is scarce, the abundance of textual and contextual testimonies provides us with a solid understanding of his life and legacy. What makes Jesus' story even more fascinating is that he, a man without wealth or political power, transformed not only the world he lived in, but also human history as a whole. His message transcended time barriers, echoing in every corner of the globe to this day. If you wish to continue this journey of learning, consider becoming a member of our channel. As a member, you'll have access to exclusive videos, in-depth content, and special discussions on religious and historical topics that will further enrich your faith. And don't forget to check out the recommended video on the screen now to continue discovering how Christianity grew after Jesus' death and the impact of his first followers. See you there.